Welcome to the Truth Expedition. I'm your co-host, Marc. You've tuned in to the program where we dig for truth in this bizarre world where the fact checkers lie, the government and the media propagandize you and me, the citizens of this amazing world. For reference, it is March 15th, 2024. And as always, once again, Gunnar Ballstead, co-host, is here. How you doing, Gunnar?
Dude, so good. We've got Marc Morano here today. We're going to talk climate alarmism, COVID lockdowns, the Great Reset. We're so excited to give this information to our audience today. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, man. How lucky are we with these amazing guests? And we did it. We outdid ourselves again today. Our guest today is Marc Morano. Marc is the founder of theclimatedepot.com and the author of The Great Reset. Not Klaus Schwab's version. The Great Reset. Global elites and the permanent lockdown. He debunks climate science and exposes the global elites. It is our pleasure to have Marc here with us today on the Truth Expedition. Thank you so much, Marc, for joining us.
Thank you, Marc. Thank you, Gunnar. Appreciate it. Happy to be here. And by the way, Glenn Beck has a book called The Great Reset, and Alex Jones actually had me on his show for an hour, and he said that my book of The Great Reset was better than his version of The Great Reset. And you can actually go to Amazon and read the reviews of people who were directed there by Alex Jones. But my book's The Great Reset, Global Elites and the Permanent Lockdown. But thank you so much for having me.
Well, timely book. Awesome. So my first question is, what in your mind is the smoking gun when it comes to like trying to convince your average person out there that the climate science isn't settled? Which fact could you point people towards if you wanted to get them to start to do their own investigation?
Well, I think the simplest, and it all changed since 2020, is just the appeal to authority no longer works with huge chunks of the population. In other words, lockdowns, mask mandates, stay-at-home orders, social distancing. If you said, well, that's what the CDC, the Centers of Disease, or the World Health Organization, like those are the top scientists, people would, a huge segment of the population would laugh at you for saying that. Well, everything I learned in the climate debate, in the COVID debate, I'd already learned in the climate debate. And I'm talking about going back decades. It was the exact same template. So what I would tell people is, if you believe the government told you 100% truth about the origin of COVID, about how lockdowns were necessary, about how social distancing. Anthony Fauci just came out and admitted that social distancing was not based in any science. It was just something that happened. They just wanted something to do, kind of like send the man to boil water when a woman's pregnant because it gives them something to do. They wanted us to have that fear aspect. But you go through all that, and I think when I tell you that the consensus is completely made up, so the idea that all scientists agree that the earth is doomed is one of the biggest points that I would make, because they claim 97%, Al Gore claims 99%. And I would just say, if you believe everything you were told in COVID, then you'll believe everything you were told in climate. And of course, obviously, both you could drive semi trucks through the truth angles and the lies that they told.
Yeah, absolutely. Gunnar?
So I think it's really important to discuss how the younger generations are being fed a bunch of nonsense propaganda about how we're doomed, how the earth is going to heat irreparably, and that we are going to basically become extinct. That is the incorrect message to be telling our young kids. They should be eating meat and procreating. Why do you think that this institution is trying to hide the previous temperature records of natural warming and climate variability? What is driving this agenda?
Well, it's a very simple, throughout history, the ruling class, governing elite, the credentialed experts, the people that went to the finest schools, who had the family connections and the wealthiest corporate, in today's world, would be the corporate media, it would be the international organizations, it would be the John Kerrys of the world. They've always tried to come up throughout history, going back thousands of human history, thousands of years, of ways the rest of us can't be free and justifications for it. And it was always crises. And actually in my book, The Great Reset, I detail how during times of declared emergencies by government is when the greatest violation of human rights occurred. The descent of the Roman Republic to an empire, a centralization of power in the Middle Ages, During Nazi Germany, Hitler consolidated his power during crises and declaring emergency powers. Of course, we had 9/11 emergency powers, which are still under effect. We're still under the 9/11 emergency declaration. And of course, the COVID emergency declaration, which just happened to end last year because the Republicans forced it, which was actually unusual. I didn't expect that. And then, of course, now they want to declare a climate emergency. But essentially, this whole agenda about climate has always been about control. And if you look at the geologic record of the Earth, 90% of Earth's history has been warmer than today. 90% of Earth's history has had less ice than today. I'm talking about the geologic history. So we are in the 10% coldest era of Earth's temperature record, and we're in the lowest CO2. So much so that when I worked in the United States Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, we had a scientist named Will Happer come in, a Princeton physicist, and he said that the Earth is in a CO2 famine, geologically speaking. So the idea that CO2 is the control knob of the climate, and that your hamburger, or you're driving that SUV, or you're not, unplugging your cell phone charger. And you could do some of this stuff for energy efficiency to save money. Nothing wrong with being energy conscious, but the idea that that's going to somehow alter hurricanes or tornadoes, floods, is just embarrassing. And grown men, grown women, people with high education levels will say these things. You have the guy who just took over as U.S. climate envoy, John Podesta. When he worked for the Obama administration, he took over for John Kerry, but when he worked for the Obama administration, they were pushing a congressional climate bill. And he actually said, we need this congressional climate bill because the storms are getting worse. First of all, the storms aren't getting worse. On climate timescales of 30, 50, 100 years, and this is acknowledged by the United Nations and the National Climate Assessment, hurricanes, floods, tornadoes, wildfires, droughts are either on no trend or declining trend. But what they can do is say it's worse than we thought. They do this with polar bears. We have more polar bears than we ever counted. Polar bears are disappearing, but they're disappearing from Al Gore's books and movies because they've never counted this many. And so, but you can still have these climate activists say it's worse than we thought. How? It's the same as in COVID. They say, well, our predictions of the future, our predictions of 50, 100 years for the polar bear are dire. Our predictions for sea level rise are dire. Florida will be underwater. When in reality, none of the data supports that, but the predictions are scary. Think back to COVID. You had Neil Ferguson in the UK. This was not alarming. The average age of death of even the first strain of COVID was over 80 years old. In Italy, when we were all hearing about all the deaths, it was people basically dying in nursing homes, people at the end of their life, past the age of life expectancy. But that was weaponized to turn it into your children could die, children can't go to school, they can't go to the playground, we have to issue emergency orders, stay at home, we become dictators overnight, churches close. And so that's the basis of everything. When current reality fails to alarm, whether you're talking about a virus or you're talking about climate, make scarier and scarier predictions of the future. And that is how their grip on power goes. And it was amazing because in climate, it was always a sort of partisan issue. You had Al Gore, the failed Democrat presidential candidate, one of the closest elections in U.S. history. He was the spokesman for that. And then you had the UN, which was already distrusted by most American conservatives distrust the UN. So climate was never that big of a threat for them to impose compared to COVID, because overnight, libertarians, conservatives, Democrats, overwhelming majorities, they were afraid of a virus that cut across bipartisan lines. So much so that now we have the medical journals led by the British Medical Journal. You have the World Health Organization. They wanted to roll climate change and merge it with public health so that we can then regulate climate through unelected bureaucracy and regulate energy under the auspices of climate change will kill you. And they've gone really far with that. The absurdity. Academics in Australia want to add climate change as a cause of death on death certificates. That was proposed right when COVID came out. You have doctors in Canada, the first doctor ever to medically diagnose a patient as suffering from climate change. He pulled out his pen and wrote on the medical chart, what condition does she have? Climate change. And she was suffering from heat stroke, so he called it climate change. And now that's being pushed. So you have the Harvard Law Review, Environmental Law Review, is pushing the idea of climate homicide, where you can now be tried. If you're an energy company and they claim a hurricane was caused by your emissions, you could have that now weighing on you. You kind of like a tobacco company responsible for lung cancer. They're going to try to say that an oil company caused deaths and there was a climate homicide. This is real. It's happening. And to sum this all up, the climate agenda, net zero, is the intentional collapse and rationing of energy, our food. They're coming after our farmers with going after nitrogen-based fertilizer, which they say is a greenhouse gas. Somehow, with farming's been around thousands of years, and the earth can't handle it suddenly in 2024. They're coming after methane to stop the meat eating. They're coming after our transportation, our gas-powered cars with gas-powered car bans. They're trying to mandate electric. They're trying to ration vehicles, a la Cuba, a la East Germany, which had the crappy Trabant. And then, of course, throughout all of this, they're trying to ration our speech and suppress and censor us if we speak out. And even on energy, you can't even now. You have during the Obama administration, and there's now other policies where if you speak out against solar and wind or EV batteries, that's going to be censored because that's considered misinformation and disinformation. We truly are living through a great reset as we sit here.
It's an insane world. You mentioned methane. I have a comment and then a question, but they're so concerned about methane, but they go ahead and blow up a pipeline that is the largest release of methane gas in the history of the world. So they're real concerned. So that's just my comment. Who started the lie, in your opinion? I've read a little bit about this, but in the 70s, the Club of Rome, they come up with this, the papers that were written then to start this narrative? Can you clarify a little there?
Yeah, well, what happened was, I went in my book. I go back. You've all heard the tipping points. AOC. We got 12 years left. You have Greta Thunberg. You have President Obama. You had NASA's Hansen. We had 4 years when President Obama was elected. That was our tipping point. Al Gore. Turns out when Abraham Lincoln was president, I was able to trace the first climate tipping point. There was an academic named George Perkins Marsh, 1864.
Wow.
Abraham Lincoln sitting in the White House. He warned of climatic excess, exact phrase, unless mankind changed our ways. The idea that CO2 can be a warming agent began in the 19th century with a Swedish physicist. The problem is, because CO2 can be a warming agent, big deal. There are literally hundreds of factors that influence our climate. Everything from water vapor, tilt to the Earth's axis, ocean cycles, clouds, volcanic dust, the sun, and all of these interact with each other. And what they've tried to do in recent times is say CO2 is the control knob. More importantly, you want to go back to the 60s. Paul Ehrlich had a book called The Population Bomb. He's still alive in his 90s. He's warning we're all going to die and it's all over. Of course, he's very good health, it seems. 60 Minutes just featured him last year. He's like 92 or 3 or something. So obviously it didn't get him, the environmental catastrophe, but essentially it didn't start out as a climate issue. It started out as resource scarcity, overpopulation. And in the 1970s, it wasn't global warming. Before fossil fuels caused global warming, fossil fuels caused global cooling. And in my book, Green Fraud, I have an entire chapter dedicated to the 1970s. There were all kinds of warnings from experts saying we should put Arctic soot on the Arctic ice caps to melt them because they were growing too fast. We had Time and Newsweek warning of climate tipping points unless we change our ways because of man-made global cooling. They thought our fossil fuels were emitting aerosols, which were blocking the sun, creating global dimming, and we're going to plunge us into another ice age. You had Walter Cronkite reporting this. You had ABC News. I put all this in my film, The Climate Hustle, the first one. It came out in 2016, to go through all the archives. And it's amazing because in the late 70s, the New York Times actually reported accurately about a climate debate. And you know what the debate was? Meteorologists were skeptical of global warming and the climatologists were warning of climate change. So in the late 70s, they had all these debates going on. Well, by the time the 80s came around, sort of big science took over and we were in a warming trend. So they're exploitive. In the 70s, we were cooling. We were on a cooling trend for 20 plus years as CO2 went up. And so they were basically riding whatever they could. Oh, it's cooling. It must be our fault. We need regulations. And they had their version of the Green New Deal back in the 70s, too. It wasn't as developed. So by the time we start warming again in the late 70s, They just say, oh, no, we were wrong about cooling. They actually don't acknowledge the cooling. They have now studies out saying the global cooling period never happened, despite the fact that you had CIA reports on it, government studies, major NASA scientists. I can document, there's so much documentation on the movement to push man-made global cooling, but now they deny it ever happened. But by the 80s, the Earth was definitely in a warming trend, and they went with that. And then, of course, insert Al Gore. He starts with Senate hearings, insert a guy named James Hansen. 1989, he testifies in Congress, but 1988. Here's the kicker, though. It really didn't solidify until 1988 when the United Nations formed the International Governmental Panel on Climate Change, their climate panel. And it was a self-interested lobbying organization funded by world governments. They were going to have annual meetings, and they were also going to have big climate reports. Their mission was not to look at climate change as a big complex system. Their mission was to look at whether CO2 controlled the climate. And they had every incentive to say, yes, not only does CO2 control the climate, but it's driving an emergency and a catastrophe. Because if they failed to come up and say CO2 was driving it, well, then they would literally cease to exist as an organization. And the UN benefited multiple ways. Not only was the UN in charge of the science, in fact, just in 2022, the UN's official actually said, we own the science of climate change, and we partnered with Google to make sure everyone else gets results that are skewed to basically support whatever the UN says. So, my website, climatedepot.com, is suppressed by Google because they have a partnership with the United Nations in the UN's own admission. This is their communication director admitted this in a TV interview. So to make a long story short, you asked, once this got solidified in 1988 and you had an international organization promoting it, and they had no reason to ever to say, because they were lobbying, if they said there was no crisis, they would cease to exist. They not only got to have the meetings and the money and the funding and all these exotic locations, but they got to be in charge of the solution. So they get to hype the science and they get to come up with the solution. That's why we have the Copenhagen Climate Agreement, the UN Paris Agreement. That's where we get net zero from. So it's like saying you can be in charge, see if there's a problem. And by the way, if there is, you'll get endless funding, organizational support. You'll get to travel the world and you'll be in charge of the solution. You'll be able to regulate every aspect of human civilization. And make no mistake, humans inhale oxygen, we exhale carbon dioxide. It's regulating every aspect of our development in our lives, from our breath. And there was actually a study last December in the UK in a peer-reviewed journal, human breath contributes to global warming. Not making that up. Africans' breath contributes more than Asians, and women's breath contributes more than men. That's why we're in this mess. It's been solidified by the deep state, by the powers that be, by the international organizations, by the corporate world, global, and by academia and governments everywhere, because it gives them power. And that's why it's not going away. It doesn't matter if the science doesn't support it. It's too good of a con to ever let go.
Yeah.
So humans have increased CO2 in the atmosphere.
Yes.
Now, why is that not an issue? What is the potency of CO2? What would happen if we doubled the CO2? Would we still be able to have ice ages? And to piggyback on that, how does Michael Mann's hockey stick fraud use CO2 to propagandize?
Okay, well, the first question is, we've had ice ages with CO2 up to 10 times higher than any current level. As I mentioned, the geologic history of the Earth shows all these temperature fluctuations, and with CO2 much higher, and we've had even colder temperatures. That's point one. Although we are in the lowest CO2 and the coldest period in our Earth's history, so we have a lot of room to go with CO2. It's wild speculation because all the ice core data shows that CO2 does not control temperature. In fact, if you look at the recent ice core data, when I say recent in climate world, it's from the late 90s or mid 90s. They came out with this ice core data. It shows that the temperature leads CO2 increase. So in other words, CO2 does not go up and then temperature follows. Temperature goes up and then CO2 goes up because the oceans release more CO2. Having said that, humans do release CO2, but not in a sufficient quantity to alter the Earth's geologic era and all the claims. There's no evidence at all to support that. And in fact, you can look at severe weather, you can look at past temperatures, and this ties right into your second part about the hockey stick. The first United Nations report in 1990, not making this up, showed the medieval warm period of about 900 to 1300 AD, much warmer than today. This was the current temperature. This was the medieval warm period temperature. And they actually had a chart. It was all official. And after that report came out, what do you think happened? All these activists were like, we can't sell a climate crisis if the earth was warmer, 500 years ago when there were no coal plants and no SUVs. So what do you think they did? We had a scientist testify from University of Oklahoma, David Deming, and our Senate hearing. I wasn't a senator. I was a senior staffer, just to clarify that. I'm not alleging to be a U.S. senator, or was, but I was a senior U.S. staffer with the Environment and Public Works Committee. He came and testified that he was on emails that people would send around from UN scientists saying, we have to get rid of the medieval warm period because it was too inconvenient. They couldn't sell the public on a climate scare because of that. That's where Michael Mann enters. By late 1999, 9 years after that first UN report, he comes up and he literally jerry-rigs all this data. In fact, it was called statistical rubbish. He was called out on the carpet multiple times for this. He wouldn't release his findings and data. When the ClimateGate emails came out in 2009, years after this hockey stick chart, which, by the way, the hockey stick deflated the medieval warm period into a flat line, got consistent with the Little Ice Age, and then they made the 20th century temperature spike, completely opposite of all known climate data up to that point. So remember, this was the medieval warm period. This was current temperatures in the first UN report. And then when Michael Mann enters the picture, he deflates the past, revises history, and then juices the current temperatures to look like the blade of a hockey stick. So it's this long thing with a little, with a big sting on the end. And we now know that his fellow colleagues in the UN weren't buying it. They were questioning his methodology. He did all kinds of statistical tricks to make it happen. And that is how we got today's climate crisis. And the cement, I guess I should say, the mortar that mixes all this together was the involvement of the United Nations, because the United Nations is a corrupt ideological institution seeking more power and a self-interested lobbying organization is willing to do anything and hype anything and distort anything to make their case, very similar to how the World Health Organization is willing to do it. And by the way, they're coming up in May in Switzerland with this big thing about the pandemic treaty and the amendments to the public health, which are going to literally include climate change as a public health threat and give Bill Gates funded scientists at the WHO instant global powers to have instant global lockdowns. So it's the same thing. If you trust public health and the way that's gone, it's been so corrupted. Climate science was like that decades before most of the public was aware of what's happened in public health.
They sure are coming after us, all of our freedoms. What do you think of people like, I think of somebody like Neil deGrasse Tyson. He's one of those that's in the bullcrap consensus. I mean, is he dumb? Is he a liar? Is he paid to do this? And then what do you believe is the actual percentage of scientists that form the bullcrap consensus? I mean, if it's not 97.
Among the clique of scientists who work with the UN and who are a part of these governing board, they always say, like, every major scientist, here's the National Academy of Science, 50,000, their governing board agrees. It's 24 governing board members of all these big science organizations, American Meteorological, et cetera. And they're steeped in politics and money, and they issue statements in line with the UN, and everyone says, see, all scientists agree. They polled their own members. There's been cases where up to 75%, in the case of American Meteorological Society at one point, was skeptical. And this is, in one case in Canada, the Canadian Royal Society never even had a meeting of the board of directors. Just ahead of it, they just released a statement. Well, of course we support it. It's all assumed. And to answer your question, like about Neil deGrasse Tyson, think about it this way. Who's among the most intelligent people in a society? You would typically think medical doctors, right? So you have to ask yourself, why are medical doctors in the United States going along with puberty blockers and transgender? It's because it's their career. It's their money, it's cancel culture, it's that pressure. They are going to go along. Europe is already canceling puberty blockers. It's still happening in the US. Doctors with a straight face will come out and claim that this is necessary for their health. They know deep down it's not, but it's that pressure. And this is how societies go off the rails. It's because of that I hate to say political correctness, but it's that pressure. And this is what happens in academia. This is what happens in science organizations like NASA. The skeptical ones are told, if you want any kind of career, you are going to shut up. So when it comes to people like Neil deGrasse Tyson, he says the dumbest things. People like Bill Nye, he's a left-wing liberal ideologue as well. He actually supported jailing climate skeptics, thought it was a reasonable idea. Because of their harming his quality of life. So these are just activists who want to win, I guess you could say, and who really don't care about the science. They're sort of ideologues in the case of that. And Neil deGrasse Tyson, I don't know enough about his background to say that, but I've seen him, and he's just given the corporate line. Imagine him like he's with a big corporation and they're having scandals and everyone's questioning it. He's just there sort of to lawyerly stay the course and keep everyone calm. That's his role. So I don't even know that he really questions it much. He probably on some level believes he's presenting the science. And that's the thing, it's the science. That's what they say. Whenever you hear that phrase, you know it's not science. It's what the politicians demand and what scientists who rely on politicians for funding are delivering. And that's what we saw just firsthand in COVID. My job's gotten a lot easier for a huge swath of the public in both Europe, the US, all over the world, because people saw firsthand how science was distorted during COVID and how it was politicized. So all I have to do is say, hey, everything you saw in COVID, that's been happening for decades in climate.
Famously, Kennedy was extremely had a very extreme position on this, where he was an advocate of jailing climate
RFK Jr.
polluters.
Yes,
RFK Jr. Yeah. But he has since switched his position. To what do you attribute that? Is it the COVID tyranny? Do you think it's part of the science where people are waking up to the alarmism? And then a question after that as well. What do you think of the WHO treaty and how it threatens the U.S. sovereignty?
All right. Well, first of all, I have a long history with RFK Jr. His campaign just reached out to me less than a year ago. They wanted the original interview. I was the one who interviewed him at the 2014, this is 10 years ago, New York City climate march. It was my questions that prompted him to say he wanted to jail climate criminals at The Hague with all the other war criminals, give them 3 square meals and a cot. And this is what he said. He also wanted to punish skeptical politicians. He was really out there. Now, fast forward. He's red-pilled by COVID lockdowns and what he sees in public health. In 2020, later 2020, he starts speaking out. He goes to Germany. He's giving rallies. He's against the lockdowns. He's against social distancing. He's comparing it to Nazi Germany and the totalitarianism. And he goes silent on climate. He just stops talking about it. So fast forward 2023, he's announcing he's running for president. Gives me chills sometimes because I believe him. I believe he's sincere. He announces for president, and you know what he says? I'm not going to talk about climate in my presidential campaign. I don't care if you believe it. It's not a convincing argument anyway. If I tell you that you're going to, this Florida's going to be underwater, you're not going to believe me. If I tell you about some computer model, he goes, I won't talk about climate in this campaign because climate change has been hijacked by the World Economic Forum and the United Nations and other international groups for totalitarian control of society. It's almost a verbatim quote of what he said. And I was like, wow, that should be the Republican position. Don't even have to get into the science. Just say that and you're done. And he actually ended up, it was an interview with Reason magazine, I believe. And they grilled him on this interview with me, and they were showing clips. And he finally sort of apologized. He said, I never should have said that. He was doing rhetorical flourish back then, but it's not the same Robert F. Kennedy today. He's really been red-pilled. He understands that public health, climate, any kind of crises is how they want to impose totalitarian control. And I, as a former Pat Buchanan activist and voter, and as a Trump supporter, at least until Trump blew it all with COVID and got duped by Fauci and made the greatest single blunder of any president in 50 years when he signed up for the 10 days to flatten the curve and made COVID a national emergency. I actually have flirted with the idea of voting for Robert F. Kennedy Jr. I probably won't because he's still pretty regulatory on too many environmental and energy issues, but it's been an amazing ride to see him come around and what his position on climate now is.
Yeah, he's good for the political landscape. Definitely have him there. I know he was
Yeah, he really is.
Yeah, I know you're short on time, and we're going to respect that. So one more question.
Sure. Thank you.
What focus should we have? I mean, I'm an environmentalist. I want my kids to be able to drink the water, breathe the air, eat the fish. I mean, I want a nice, clean environment. What focus should we have? Because they've distracted us and pushed us away from what we should really care about. What do you think we need to focus on when it comes to environment?
This is a great question. Okay. 1970, the first Earth Day. Now, I am ambivalent about it. I got, there was a lot of wackos at the first Earth Day. In fact, the founder was later found, I think he composted his girlfriend. He murdered her and hid the body. The Earth, I think his name was Hayes, the founder of Earth Day. So there's also a lot of what you call ice age scare people. But what really drove the first Earth Day and the subsequent Earth Days initially was about air pollution and water quality and just land use issues. And to that, I credit it. I credit the first Earth Day because it drew attention to our major cities, to the East River in New York City, to the rivers in Pittsburgh and Cleveland. They were disgusting. There wasn't a lot of corporate responsibility. It was never really on anyone's radar. At least I'm talking when I say it was on people's radar, but it wasn't in the general consciousness. 1970 Earth Day rode that wave, and people said, we will not live in this. We want cleaner air. We want clean water. So what happened? You had the Environmental Protection Agency start, and there were environmental regulations, but the corporations and companies and local levels of government and communities started caring about it. And so since 1970, we've had radical improvements in air and water quality, while at the same time having massive increases in economic growth, wealth, prosperity, and massive increases in population. We did it. We solved the problem of air and water quality to the point where the World Health Organization says the United States has among the cleanest air in the world. And that's on my website if you go to climatedepot.com. So that's point one. Point two is that mainstream media is acknowledged that we've pretty much done everything we can. We've really solved the environmental problems. So they need something more nebulous, like a climate crisis. They don't want to give up. So climate has hijacked the entire environmental movement. I've interviewed left-wing professors, a guy named Dennis Rancourt at University of Ottawa, who's basically said climate change is an imaginary problem of the first world middle class. He's said that climate change has hijacked the environmental movement, and that all other environmental issues have fallen to the wayside. In fact, if you look at Gallup polling, decade after decade, and I mean that, decade after decade, climate change ranks the lowest among Americans' concern among all environmental issues. It's lower than species extinction, air and water quality, deforestation, and then climate change is dead last, according to Gallup, every year. They just can't sell this dead horse to the public. But the good news is rejoice, because we've actually solved air and water problem. And also the good news, I mentioned species. We now know how to recover species. We know how to privately breed them. We know how to save them. We know how to do conservation. Endangered species is a huge success story. The number of extinctions have dropped dramatically in the last century. And so that's another. And we've also done major advances in deforestation. We have what you'd call sustainable forestry. I did a whole documentary on the Amazon rainforest. Within 7 years, if you not clear cut, but log, not clear cutting a forest like poor people would do, the slash and burn agriculture of poor agrarian farmers, but say a modern timber company, you could have, if you take out the swaths instead of clear cutting, within 7 years, you can't distinguish that logged forest from ones that haven't been logged in a century or more. There's no such thing as old growth forests, because forests are always being flooded. They're being burned by nature. It's got nothing to do with that. But you can't distinguish the plant and animal species within 7 years if you log correctly. And we've got all that technology. We've got all those techniques. We have the wealth in the first world to do it. The key now is allowing the developing world, Africa, South America, Asia, to continue to get wealth and prosperity, because guess what happens when they do that? their environments will clean up. And by the way, China is a hellhole. China the average city in China looks like Pittsburgh in the United States in 1890 with all the smog and the soot around the turn of the century, 1900. But China will radically improve as they go through rapid industrialization. They will clean up. The same thing will happen with every other poor country, and they will end up with much cleaner environments because wealthier countries and prosperous countries have the cleanest environments. It's the poorer countries. It's the centrally command socialist countries. Eastern Europe had some of the worst and filthiest environments in all of Europe under Soviet control and domination.
Wow. So a positive message there that we get to leave the audience with. So thank you so much, Mark. That was
Thank you, Mark and Gunnar. Yeah, I appreciate it.
Jam-packed. So everybody hit the like button. Share this episode because this is important information, and we'll check the show notes. We're going to have all of Mark's Twitter handle, his documentaries, his books, everything like that. But thank you for tuning in to the Truth Expedition. Do not tread on me and do not shed on me.